Imagine losing everything. Not metaphorically, not dramatically, actually losing it. That was Ruth's situation. There was no big explosion, no single bad decision that ruined everything. Things simply fell apart one by one. First, the food ran out. Famine has a way of doing that. Then people started moving because staying hungry is rarely a winning strategy. So families migrated, hoping that somewhere else things might be slightly less terrible. Ruth followed that movement without much choice in the matter. It wasn't a brave decision. It was necessity. When food disappears, pride usually follows. For a while, life continued. Not comfortably, but adequately. And then it didn't. Naomi, Ruth's mother-in-law, lost her husband. That was bad enough. Then she lost her sons. That was worse. And suddenly, the family structure holding everything together collapsed completely. No husband, no children, no safety net. At this point, Ruth had no legal, cultural, or practical obligation to stay. In fact, everything about her situation pointed in the opposite direction. Culturally, leaving made sense. Socially, it was expected. Practically, it was smart. She was young. She had her own people. She could still start over. From the outside, the solution was painfully obvious. Go home, rebuild, protect yourself, move on. That's what most people would have advised. That's what survival manuals usually recommend. Step 1, minimize loss. Step 2, increase safety. Step 3, don't attach yourself to sinking ships. And Naomi's situation, respectfully, looked like a sinking ship. There were no guarantees left, no clear future, no plan that ended well. Staying meant choosing uncertainty on purpose, which is generally frowned upon. Ruth could leave with dignity. She could walk away without being judged. No one would blame her. In fact, people would probably nod in understanding and say things like, "That makes sense," or "She did the right thing." Because by every measurable standard, leaving was the correct move. Zero resources, zero protection, zero strategic advantage, manual of survival, non-existent. And that's exactly what makes this moment interesting. Because the story doesn't hinge on a miracle here. There's no divine interruption, no sign in the sky, no dramatic speech convincing Ruth to stay. Just a quiet pause, a moment where a choice has to be made. Everything in Ruth's world pointed toward walking away. Logic agreed, culture approved, self-preservation applauded. And right there, precisely where the obvious path was clear, Ruth hesitated, not because she saw a future, not because she had a plan, but because sometimes the most important decisions happen when nothing looks promising at all. And that's where the unexpected choice begins. Ruth decides to stay. That's it. No build-up, no negotiation. She doesn't ask for time. She doesn't ask for conditions. She doesn't ask what happens next if things go wrong, which, statistically speaking, they probably will. From a practical standpoint, this is a terrible move. Staying means remaining with Naomi in a foreign land. No extended family, no legal protection, no clear role, no promised future. Just two widows with limited options and even fewer guarantees. And importantly, no audience. There is no crowd watching this moment, no elders weighing in, no friends offering advice, no one standing nearby saying, "Are you sure about this?" It's just two women standing at a border, one preparing to return home, the other standing still. Borders have a way of clarifying things. On one side is familiarity, language you know, customs you understand, people who recognize you. On the other side is uncertainty, where even basic routines feel foreign. Ruth knows this. That's what makes the decision stranger, not braver. If this were a strategic choice, there would be math involved. Risks calculated, benefits listed, a backup plan quietly prepared. But none of that happens. Ruth doesn't bargain. She doesn't request guarantees. She doesn't ask Naomi to promise anything in return. She doesn't even explain herself, which from the outside is mildly alarming. Modern logic would strongly advise against this. It's like choosing the hardest possible route without knowing if it leads anywhere useful. The kind of decision people later describe by saying, "I don't know what I was thinking." Except Ruth is thinking, just not strategically. Because this choice isn't about outcomes, it's about attachment. She isn't staying because the future looks good. She's staying because leaving would mean abandoning someone who has already lost everything else, and that weighs more than logic in this moment. This isn't heroism, it's loyalty without a plan. The strange part is how quiet it is. No dramatic speech, no emotional explosion, no attempt to justify the decision so it sounds reasonable. She simply chooses to remain. And the moment passes. No thunder, no immediate reward, no reassurance that this will work out. Just a decision placed gently into the future, like setting something down and hoping it doesn't break. From here on, everything depends on that choice. Not in an obvious way. Not instantly, but slowly, quietly, in ways that won't be visible until much later. At this point, nothing improves yet. Life doesn't suddenly get easier. Hunger doesn't disappear. Risk doesn't vanish. But the direction has changed, and sometimes that's the only thing a decision does at first. It changes where the story is allowed to go next. Nothing spectacular happens, and that's the point. There's no dramatic turnaround after Ruth's decision. No sudden improvement in circumstances. No montage where everything magically works out because she made the right choice. Life just continues. The next days are about work. Simple work. The kind of work no one writes songs about. Fields instead of houses. Routine instead of resolution. Survival instead of progress. Ruth wakes up early. She goes where there is work to be done. She gathers what's left behind. She does not stand out because she talks a lot or explains herself well. She stands out because she shows up again. And again. This is not glamorous, it's repetitive, it's quiet. It's the slow rhythm of doing what needs to be done without knowing if it will be enough. There are no visible miracles here. No shortcuts. No moments where someone steps in and fixes the system. Life runs in basic mode. Work, eat, rest, repeat. From the outside, this doesn't look like progress. It looks like stalling, like delaying an inevitable collapse. Because consistency doesn't guarantee safety. It only does one of two things. It quietly builds something, or it delays things falling apart. And at this point, it's not clear which one is happening. Ruth could stop. No one is forcing her to keep going. She could slow down, blend in, do the bare minimum. That would still be understandable. But she doesn't. She keeps working. Not dramatically harder than everyone else, just reliably. She stays late. She follows the rules. She doesn't demand special treatment. She doesn't draw attention to herself, which ironically is what draws attention. People notice patterns, especially in places where most days look the same. Constancy stands out more than enthusiasm ever could. Boaz notices, not because Ruth introduces herself, not because she tells her story, not because she asks for help. He notices because she is there, every day, doing the same work, with the same quiet focus. He watches. He asks a few questions. He observes how she moves through the field, and what he sees isn't ambition, it's steadiness. Respect starts there. Not because Ruth demands it, not because she earns it through a speech, but because consistency over time becomes difficult to ignore. Still, nothing changes immediately. The work remains hard. The future remains unclear. Ruth is still vulnerable. One bad decision, one shift in circumstance, one unlucky moment could undo everything. But something subtle has happened. The story has slowed down enough for someone to see her. Not as a problem, not as a burden, but as someone worth paying attention to. And that's how most turning points begin. Not with noise, not with announcements, but with observation. Someone notices. Someone pauses. Someone starts seeing value where there was only background before. And that observation, quiet, unremarkable, easy to miss, begins to change the direction of everything. The story speeds up, without making any noise. There's no announcement, no dramatic turning point that everyone notices at once. Things just start moving faster because someone finally decides to act. Boaz steps in, not as a rescuer, and definitely not as a grand romantic figure, more like an adult who sees a situation and realizes it's his responsibility to handle it properly. He takes responsibility. That means protection, in very practical terms. Clear instructions. Boundaries enforced. A safer environment. Nothing flashy. Nothing symbolic. just real-world adjustments that make daily life less fragile. This is not a fairy tale moment. There's no dramatic confession, no sweeping gestures, no emotional speeches under the moonlight. What happens instead is much more mundane and far more effective. Adults solving problems like adults. Boaz doesn't act because Ruth impressed him with ambition. She didn't campaign for attention. She didn't position herself strategically. She didn't chase power or status. Ironically, that's what made space for both. By staying focused on survival and consistency, Ruth created room for something else to happen. Not by pushing forward, but by not collapsing inward. It's the kind of recognition that doesn't need convincing. No persuasion required. No argument presented. Value gets acknowledged simply because it's been quietly visible for long enough. It's like when someone finally notices the coworker who always shows up on time, fixes problems without credit, and never complains, and suddenly realizes, oh, this person matters. That's what changes here. Ruth's situation shifts, not overnight, and not magically, but meaningfully. She is no longer just surviving day to day. She starts to belong to something more stable. The work has structure now. The risk is managed. The future is no longer a complete blank space. This doesn't erase vulnerability. It doesn't guarantee safety forever. But it does create continuity, something Ruth hasn't had in a long time. For the first time since everything collapsed, life stops feeling temporary. And that's the real shift. Not wealth, not status, belonging. Ruth didn't chase this outcome. She didn't even aim for it. She simply stayed consistent long enough for someone else to see what was already there. Which is why this moment matters. Because nothing about this was forced. Nothing was demanded. Nothing was manipulated. It all came from quiet decisions stacking up until a door opened. And here's the part that's easy to miss. This isn't just about Ruth anymore. What looks like a personal resolution is actually setting something much larger in motion. The stability that forms here doesn't stop with her. It extends outward, into family lines, into history, into consequences she couldn't possibly have predicted. At this point, Ruth still doesn't know any of that. She only knows that she's no longer drifting, that survival has turned into belonging, that silence somehow became a doorway. But the full weight of that decision hasn't landed yet, because the impact of this choice goes far beyond her life, and the story isn't done expanding. It didn't feel historic, but it quietly redirected history. Looking back, the pattern becomes clear, not because it was dramatic, but because it was consistent. One silent choice, followed by ordinary days, leading to a future that slowly took shape. Nothing about Ruth's decision announced itself as important. At the time, it didn't come with meaning attached. It wasn't labeled as brave, strategic, or visionary. It was simply the next step she refused to walk away from. And yet, that choice rearranged more than her own life. Ruth didn't aim for legacy. She aimed for survival. She didn't plan outcomes. She handled days, one after another. Work, rest, repeat. Faithful to the routine, not to a prediction. That's what makes the result surprising. Because the stability that formed around her didn't stop with her. It extended forward, quietly, almost invisibly, into family lines and long-term consequences no one in that moment could see. Ruth becomes part of a lineage, a family story that continues, a name that doesn't disappear. Eventually, that line leads to David. And from there to a much larger story that would be told and retold for generations. Not because Ruth intended that outcome, but because her decision allowed the story to keep moving forward. This isn't about destiny being obvious in hindsight. It's about how small, uncelebrated decisions often do the most work. Most real change doesn't begin with visible courage. It begins with quiet faithfulness, with choosing not to abandon something important when leaving would be easier. That's still true now. In modern terms, it's like committing to a difficult path without knowing what it unlocks, accepting the harder option without expecting it to justify itself immediately. Staying consistent when there's no guarantee that consistency will pay off. Ruth didn't know the impact of her choice. She didn't see a future worth betting on. She simply knew what she was not willing to walk away from. And that turned out to be enough. She didn't choose greatness. She didn't chase significance, she chose to remain. The story doesn't suggest that every hard choice leads to a great outcome. It doesn't promise rewards for loyalty. It just shows how direction matters more than visibility. One decision changed where the story was allowed to go, and that's the quiet lesson at the center of it all. Not every turning point feels important when it happens. Some only reveal their weight much later, when the consequences finally line up. So the real question isn't whether a choice looks meaningful in the moment, it's whether it changes the direction of the story. And now that story continues. If you want to see another moment like this, where a simple decision reshaped everything, which one should we simplify next? Esther, Hannah, or Joseph?